to start teaching some philosophy in September.
Well, thanks very much. So yeah, I'm going to give you this talk, Go Forth and Multiply. That's its new title, which I'm very proud of. Kind of a goofy joke. I've given this talk a whole load of times, and this morning I totally rejigged the order of everything, so I know what's on every slide, but I don't know what's coming up, so it should be exciting to go through it. I've also tried to cut out a lot of the philosophy stuff that I thought wouldn't be of as much interest to people here, but I wanted to give you two sort of big points to take away. First one is that I really want to emphasize the imperatives in proofs and mathematical language more generally, as you saw in the title. And this is going to link to a second point, which is one about epistemology. It's about mathematical knowledge and the sort of knowledge we have. And at the end, I want to talk a bit about how this links to some of the things we've heard over the last couple of weeks, especially at the workshop, because this distinction between knowing how and knowing that, I think, is a really nice one from epistemology. And lots of times people were talking about various things that they're working on, and I thought, you know what, you're talking about knowing how and knowing that, so I want this to be translated across in something for people to take away and actually be able to learn something from the philosophical side that is useful to automation.
That's the take-home message. Philosophy is useful.
Yeah, you want to employ philosophers to do things with you. Yeah, not for the next year or so, after that. Good. So here's something that I think might be familiar to a lot of you. Is this book by Mohan Ganaslingham on the language of mathematics. And it's a wonderful book, and it's got loads and loads of excellent analysis of the sort of linguistic constructions that you find in mathematics, generally, and in particular in proofs. But there's one thing that I think is missing, which is an analysis of all of the imperatives that you find in proofs. So here is a quote which is, as far as I could find, the main point where he even mentions the existence of imperatives in mathematics, and he seems it doesn't take them very seriously. So, the language of mathematics consists purely of assertions about mathematical objects. There's some stuff in between, but the first person plural we is also used in a more restricted capacity with a limited and potentially closed class of verbs, typically to refer to the mutual intent of the author and reader. And I guess what he has in mind here is we denote this by x, or we choose a variable, this sort of stuff. But I think here, with a limited and potentially closed class of verbs, I suppose what he has in mind is that there's this standard list of things that we expect to see in mathematical proofs. So things like note that, or observe, or let G be a group, as Benedict's example he works on. So there's some standard ones, but I think that this underestimates the number of imperatives we find, and I think it also restricts them in a way that isn't natural to mathematics. I think there's a lot more out there. So the reason this is worthwhile is that, well, if you look at the logic of imperatives, one of the real classic texts.
Can you go back to slide? Yeah. So this just seems wrong. This is just that it underestimates.
Yeah.
Is it the case that, has anyone done a study of how much of mathematics purely about mathematical objects?
Oh yeah, this first line. Yeah, I think maybe that is more just out of context, because it can't really mean that, right? If you look at a text.
Excluding the introductory.
Yeah, excluding different things, yeah. So maybe to be more fair, maybe this is just within a proof or something like that, but still, I don't think it's true. Yeah. This is why I've picked it out. So I love this book because it's full of things that I think are really on the money and interesting instructions. And then there's this stuff where he just completely misses the imperatives and stuff that isn't just assertions. Right? I was just going to point out here that in there's this paper on the logic of imperatives that's a real classic, and its first example that shows up is one from mathematics, let fx be a continuous function. So I think if you're thinking about imperatives, you think, oh yeah, of course maths is full of them, but somehow in analysing mathematical language, it's not something we've really done.
That was written in the early days of printing, was it?
Yeah, it's good. I wish that my articles were published like this. It looks wonderful. Yeah.
What date is it roughly?
Let me think. I think it's an early 70s paper, but I might be wrong on that.
Early 70s, when still, publishers had proper
time.
values to do twilly stuff, whatever right now twilly stuff is.
Well, I'm sure the authors typeset that themselves in tech, probably.
Yeah, actually, starting off my papers with a huge capital letter. We love
There's a package for that.
Yeah. Yeah, what I was going to do, I don't know how much convincing you need of what proofs look like, but I've taken random samples from the archive to show off the sort of imperatives that show off. This one's maybe more intended for philosophical audiences who don't know what proofs look like so much, but what I've done, I've just highlighted all of the proofs and highlighted all of the imperatives and the sort of action words that we find there. And first of all, this should look like a normal proof, and that should then be enough to show you that it's not all just assertions about mathematical objects, right? All that remains is finding. We observe this, exclude things, apply, conclude, lots of these things. And what I think, even in these quick examples, some of them have very standard ones that denote assume, but there's also other things that are showing up. So if you're drawing up a list, you might not think of split straight away. There's this one, these are quite standard ones, but maybe the last example has some really nice ones. Instead work with some other thing after applying a lemma, splitting colorings, because it's colorings. So yeah, I think there's lots and lots of diverse sort of imperatives, and this is an important fact about how proofs are written and facts about how proofs are done. Oh yeah, here's a couple more proofs which entirely are imperatives, which maybe people here know where these come from. I'm not going to tell you, but I thought these were lovely examples. A proof by think or proof by diddling. This is a very well-known example. It's, yeah, but I like this in contrast to a proof being trivial. It's a proof. There's a single command, and well, think about it, and then you'll realize it must be true. Especially because I could barely pass it, so couldn't think about it so much. A very similar thing. Here's a recipe from Jamie Oliver on how to make a certain kind of sweet banana-based dishes. And what you're meant to observe here is that in lots of ways it looks quite similar. So here's again, peel the bananas and preheat the oven, drizzle with honey. And even though there's a number of standard actions that you perform in cooking, of course, you wouldn't expect to be able to get a nice contained list of all of the ones that you're expecting to show up or something like that. So.
But actually, that's kind of exactly what an informal proof is. It's a recipe for constructing.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. So,
sorry.
yeah,
I think we can have an interesting debate about this at the end. I'm finding myself violently disagreeing.
Wonderful.
Control.
Yeah, I mean, the recipe analogy has shown up before, and it's shown up in a way that I don't think is quite right. So it's shown up as it being a recipe for constructing a formal proof or something like this. And it's something Jody Izumi, who's a philosopher of mathematics, Tufts, disagrees with this before replacing it with a different kind of formalist view. Brendan Lava, who's just down the road, also disagrees, but has quite the opposite view from Izumi. So they don't like the recipe idea more generally. And I think there's lots of reasons it doesn't work. I don't like this idea of being a recipe to construct a formal proof. But I do like the recipe analogy more generally because I think there's this very close similarity to it. Proof that the way they're written, it has certain sort of statements, but it also has very clear instructions on how to move from where you are to the next stage in the proof. And yeah, I really like talking about recipes or instructions or directions to get from one place to another, and various similar analogies. And of course, an analogy is just that. It's not so important, but what I think comes out of it is that it's providing you with this series of actions to carry out, where the author has hopefully made the cake that they're telling you about or proved the result, and they want you to be able to sort of repeat it and go through the same cooking or the same reasoning steps. So that's the real important, right? And the extra conclusion that if you want to eat your dessert, you also have to carry out the same activity. You actually have to do it yourself. And this will come back to relations and mathematical knowledge. So I don't know whether what I'm saying is already obvious to you or something else, but I've got a quote from Kenny Eastman, who says lots of very sensible things about proofs, and has this very nice notion of transferability. So this is in a debate about whether or not probabilistic proofs are really proofs or not. And so he has this criterion which he thinks rules out probabilistic proofs and rules in kind of classical proofs, deductive steps. And, the idea is called transferability. And there the basic idea is that a proof must be such that a relevant expert will become convinced of the truth of the conclusion of that proof just by consideration of each of the steps in the proof. So it's the proof kind of represents a self-contained thing. So I think what I'm talking about with the recipe thing, it tells you all of the things that you need to do. It becomes self-contained in a certain way that you shouldn't have a recipe and need to go and look up some other thing in the meantime. But even with very sensible stuff, he still talks about a proof as a sequence of propositions, and a sequence of propositions constituting the proof, and nothing about the sort of probabilistic stuff. I suppose once you're thinking about imperatives, imperatives linking up to propositions as a philosophical can of worms, but it's not clear that that's how things are. That you're not just thinking about propositional content, you're thinking about sentences that command you to undertake certain actions, and they won't have truth conditions in the same sort of way in lots of things. And I suppose one of the useful things in thinking about this and analysing the language of mathematics in a way is that if we try too hard to force proofs into a system where you get rid of all of the imperatives, you kind of lose some of the flavour of mathematics, and you lose some of the intuitiveness. So I think that something is lost if we think just of sequences of propositions.
I missed something that you said out there. Were you talking about the probabilistic method for proofs? I mean, what did you mean by probabilistic proof?
Oh, that was just the topic of Eastman's paper. It's just about whether or not, say, primality testing. If you show that something is prime via certain tests that assure you up to any arbitrary thing, whether that counts as a proof or not. And philosophers often don't think so, and I think mathematicians are split. Maybe you tell me.
Okay, that's fair. But,
yeah.
But the probabilistic method is actually a fairly rigorous way.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, no, yeah. So in Eastman's paper, he was trying to give something that was special about proofs as they're traditionally conceived, that would rule out things that were not 100% certain or whatever. So that's so thinking about proofs as involving a heavy dose of actions and action-heavy terminology, it's not new to me. So Brendan Lawler, I mentioned earlier, discusses this. He thinks of proofs as systems of inferential actions and linked together. And he's got a nice quote here, which I've put up because it emphasizes that what I'm saying shouldn't even really just be restricted to informal proofs or proofs that are written. It's also when we're thinking about things that are more formal, logic heavy. So Lawler, he says, orthodox philosophical education urges us to forget that the movement from one line of a proof to the next is an action. Nevertheless, the rules of inference coded in formal systems are procedures, that is, standardized actions. Proving is an activity even when the results are mechanically checkable. Which I thought was important. It's not that I make gets formalization, I think it's important. Related to this, maybe I'll skip this. It's a very nice paper about the actions involved in cutting up shapes. Thinking about proofs as recipes works very well with diagrammatic proofs and the diagrams that show up in proofs that mix things. So one of the problems that maybe philosophers have with diagrammatic proofs is that a diagram, like a picture tells 1,000 words, and it's not clear what expression or what propositions are being expressed by a diagram. So you say, well, is it this exact thing or this exact thing? How can they be properly general? and sort of picking out which propositions are expressed. If you get that wrong, then you can lead to fallacies and classically bad proofs about proving that, say, every triangle is isosceles or something like that, which is obviously a bad thing to happen. But thinking about this, diagrams are used to give us instructions in ways that everyone is familiar with in day-to-day lives. And so I think this idea of finding which proposition is expressed is kind of a red herring. It's not something that is as big a deal as they are, because we're very used to following instructions that we get from diagrams and in various ways. So I've picked out here, this is a picture from Lego instructions of building a certain Star Wars Lego craft, which is very cool. And on the right you can see this picture of Ikea and some Ikea bed frame that they're putting together. I've picked these out because they have some elements that are very familiar from sort of certain strands of diagrammatic proof that I'll show you in a second. In particular, these kind of bits where you do like a sub-part of the proof and then slot it in and do actions, the diagrams pointing where things go, setting out the list of components that you have at the beginning. And the Ikea one as well, there's something very nicely dynamic here. Because we're thinking about social proofs, there's two people working together here. It's a social activity. I like this one as well because it's got this don't use that tool, put it away, don't think about it. I think that's something very nice. And yeah, negate the LMPO. That's good. And now by the magic of PowerPoint, look, it's a proof. So I grabbed this out of Proofs About Words, which it's a lovely book of sort of diagrammatic reasoning and things. I picked an example here which had some similar features, so that the arrows pointing us through various things. Effective things. Ah, yeah, so I've got a whole screen of them in case you want some mathematical content, figure out all these proofs in one go. There's lots of stuff going on in these pictures that I think are about instructions of how to think about things in particular ways. Maybe this bottom one of the Pythagoras is a particular nice one, so it's about seeing the two smaller squares sort of slowly moving across on top of each other and then dropping them down and then reinterpreting things. It's a very cute proof, and this isn't, I think, particularly rigorous because when you start thinking about it, you think, actually, I need to be sure that this thing will work as well, and then you think about it and go, well, it will work, but they never told me how to figure that out. I know how basic geometry works. Yeah, I thought this one here, this diagram looks a lot like the sort of Lego instructions of putting things together and rearranging. I think we're very good at reading instructions off of diagrams, and I think that Lego instructions probably as rigorous as mathematical proofs. Maybe that's a controversial claim. So I think there's interesting things to learn from comparing these two. Right, so having laid out this sort of action-heavy perspective, I wanted to switch across to tell you a bit about mathematical knowledge and this know-how in particular. And the big source for these ideas comes from this wonderful paper by Yehuda Rav on why do we prove theorems that Benedict made me read quite a few years ago now, and has been quoted basically in every talk that I've given since. And I don't agree with everything that Rav says, but he has some wonderful insights into everything. So this is a big quote, but I'll read it out to you. So, proofs, rather than the statement forms of theorems, are the bearers of mathematical knowledge. Theorems are in a sense just tags, labels for proofs, summaries of information, headlines of news, editorial devices. The whole arsenal of mathematical methodologies, concepts, strategies, and techniques for solving problems, the establishment of interconnections between theories, the systematization of results, the entire mathematical know-how is embedded in proofs. And what Rav is trying to emphasize is really what I've highlighted here in the last line, is that whether a particular theorem is true or not in and of itself isn't that interesting. What's interesting is how you get there and how it relates to other things and how everything is related to one another. And in particular, the emphasis that he's putting on it is about this know-how, about knowing the techniques and the strategies and how to apply knowledge that you already have to new results and new situations. I'll say more on that in a second. what Rav is saying is very similar to Gilbert Ryle, who is a famous philosopher who wrote this distinction, sort of came up with the knowing how, knowing that distinction kind of in a substantial way. It's really the sort of forefather of the epistemological tradition. And he says lots of wonderful things that I really like. But he talks about logic as well. He's the informal guy. So, for example, knowing a rule of inference is not possessing a bit of extra information, but being able to perform an intelligent operation. So the know-how isn't just about knowing some particular facts. It's about being able to do things intelligently and do things well. He doesn't think that this necessarily can be coded into some neat list of rules that you can give to someone and they can follow immediately. So here's what he says: we certainly can, in respect to many practices like fishing, cooking, and reasoning, extract principles from their application by people who know how to fish, cook, and reason. Hence Isaac Walton, Mrs. Beeton, and Aristotle. Aristotle being an example of a reasoner. But when we try to express these principles, we find that they cannot easily be put into the indicative mood. They fall automatically into the imperative mood. The result here, of course, links to what I've been saying about the imperatives and proofs, because even if you're trying to give advice to people, it comes out in this sort of way of like, this is how you go about doing it. And so finding that these imperatives show up so much in mathematical proofs is something I think that's significant for thinking about what sort of knowledge we're getting out of proofs. And I think that it's a combination of sort of factual knowledge and this know-how. That's important. Yeah, I've been talking about this, the distinction between knowledge how and knowing that. What is it exactly? Well, it's the distinction between knowing like particular statements or particular truths that are just nice, neat sentences, and knowing how. In philosophy, the examples that are always given are knowing how to ride a bike, or knowing how to ski, or knowing how to play the piano. But I think there can be more intellectual pursuits as well, so and knowing how to solve a quadratic equation. Something you can pick your favorite. So the first part of the talk on imperatives, of course, it links to this because if we think that mathematics proofs are often phrased in this kind of recipe way of telling us how to carry out a certain series of actions, then we should know how to carry out the actions. And then there's this real importance of actually knowing how to do things. And I put that it's important for several different things. In maths education, there's people in maths education already thinking about these distinctions. So Gila Hanna, who is going to be at our workshop in December, says several things about knowing how, and the real importance is that if you're trying to teach knowing how, it's not about telling people particular rules so much as inducting them into a practice. So it's about showing them how to do things and training people in how to respond, and it's very important for education because as teachers, you'll probably all recognize that this is how you go about telling students how to approach problems and things like that. Yeah, it's important in mathematics education. Mathematical knowledge libraries is something that we've heard about lots of times over the last sort of week and a half in the workshop. And this is often about sort of having all of the theorems there and maybe how they connect to one another. Taking this kind of Ravian point that the important stuff is what goes on in the proofs, I think there's a very important message that I'd like to take away here, which is that if we really want to store mathematical knowledge, you need to be storing the knowledge of how, which techniques should be used in which situations and how to do this. And something that I thought was really amazing for this was Katja's talk on being able to sort of look up or compare, using automated reasons to sort of pick out the similar strategies that can be applied again and again. I think that's super important and links very much into thinking about mathematical knowledge as having a strong component of knowing how to do things. Yeah. And so there's a paper I haven't put up here on the classification of finite simple groups by Alma Steingart that we've discussed a fair bit, where she's worried that because it's this huge effort with lots of people that put together lots of papers, that the sort of know-how will be forgotten, that people won't know how to do it anymore, that even if the papers are all out there still, that somehow the theorem will be uninvented because you're kind of missing some crucial component. I think in a large respect, the crucial component is the know-how. So being able to keep track of the know-how is a major important thing to do. And I think that is a role that some of the mathematical libraries we've talked about should be able to fit into really nicely. So I think this should be sort of high on the list of aims that they should have. I said I was leaving out the philosophy. There's a huge quote from Plato at the end of the time. If you want to see this, I can put it up in a second. It's Socrates complaining about mathematicians talking as if they're practical men. They talk about squaring, applying, adding, and the like. But they're totally wrong on this. And well, the big conclusion that I have is that Plato is wrong on this particular issue. That mathematical knowledge is often about mathematical activities, and it's about the knowledge how. And so the other conclusion that I was pushing, of course, was that the language of mathematics is full of quite diverse imperatives and descriptions of activities, and we're hoping to do more kind of concrete empirical studies of just how diverse that is. But I think we should take these seriously if we want to know what proofs are, and of course, knowing what proofs are is useful for formalizing proofs. That's why it's relevant here. I spoke a little bit about diagrammatic proofs, and finally, I told you that we should really take on board the knowledge how distinction and be thinking about this when we're thinking about how to sort of put together all of mathematical knowledge. And that is all I have to say. Thanks very much.
Okay, let's have the debate now.
So, what you didn't mention, but I think it's very kind of, for me, the only important thing. So, to say a mathematical proof is has imperatives in, or is a series of steps, to me is just kind of a truism, really.
Mm-hmm.
But the crucial thing is it's a program, right? It tells you how to describes how to carry out some actions that happen in time, okay, necessarily, only even if abstractly. But the distinction between an arbitrary program and a proof is that I wouldn't count as a proof a series of instructions that I couldn't see were describing a terminating procedure, right? And actually, you in fact gave some very fishy examples with those diagrams. There were some diagrams there that had dots in them. To me, wouldn't constitute a proof at all, because it's not at all clear that that procedure stops and gives you the result. Yeah. So I think an important distinction is, a proof wouldn't be repeat this procedure until you get the result. End of proof, because there's no guarantee that you will ever finish. Whereas if you then provide separately another justification for why you are going to stop, well, then you have proved it. But of course, that's
right.
Yeah, that's a proof and not just a program.
I see. Yeah. So in thinking about these things, I think you're totally right. There's something that's left very implicit.
It was on another slide.
Was it maybe the previous?
Yeah, look, there we are. ...
Carry on doing it. Yeah.
You're proving something with
So actually, I think in proof without words, this is a very common feature that they're doing implicit inductions or running forward. And I think it is just a feature of these kind of diagrams that
Euler would have loved it. But
yeah, but it's a feature that they want you to be generalizing them in various ways. So in fact, if you look at the next slide, here you want to be generalizing because you need to see that you're building up cubes on top of cubes and then just taking away one edge.
It would be really cool to have some Ikea instructions that had that characteristic.
Yeah, infinite Ikea.
It's like a recipe that says cook until done.
Yes.
You should turn a screw, and how do you know that it never stops? Mathematicians use these dots routinely and consider as perfectly valid ways of describing, if it is clear from the context how it translates.
Actually, I remember Erdős giving a talk once where he mentioned some 19th century argument that the square is the most area efficient figure for a given perimeter, and it works by basically repeatedly chopping it in half and seeing that if there's anything you redistribute it, and you keep doing that, and eventually you end up with something that has no asymmetry in it. So any asymmetry that you see, you chop it along that and redistribute it. So the person listening to this proof said there's something wrong with it, there's something wrong with it. And then he came back and said, how do I know it converges? So I think that there are proofs like that which, in which the recipe, the imperatives that you give are actually not terminating.
Yeah.
Actually, for a mathematician, a proof might be wrong. And the fact that you can talk about a proof being wrong or a proof being right means that a proof for a mathematician is not the same thing as a proof for a computer scientist.
But maybe once you've discovered it's wrong, would you still call it a proof? Is it, no, I don't know.
Well, a proof is something that looks like a proof syntactically and semantically, whether it's verified or not.
So I remember when early in my career, I used to say, hence this is a valid theorem. And, people started objecting to that.
Yes, theorems can have.
And of course, it's always proof by intimidation. Clearly, or it's obvious that.
Did George, you have something? Anyone here want to say something? Yeah, you did one.
So could a new instruction be to say now use your formal math system to do the rest of the proof?
Yeah, nice. I mean, I guess this is what we're going to be talking about afterwards, related to Paul. Yeah, whether that's a good proof or not. I think this is why I was looking at the transferability paper. So Kenny Uterman's transferability criterion would rule that sort of stuff out, because somehow it requires doing some stuff that is not self-contained in the proof or something like that. Yeah, whether that's good or not, I mean, this comes down to prevailing attitudes. Seems like something fishy there for me, but it might be a...
But if you think instead about proofs that say, where the punchline is, now calculate this number and it's such and such in situations that aren't as controversial as Tom Hale's calculating this number. I mean, in the days when calculation was something you did by hand and not on a machine, then styles of proof, cultures of proof, acceptability of what constituted good, solid effort were rather different. Now calculate this number, but I'm not actually going to show you the working. I'm going to tell you this is the power series I used and this is the answer I got, but I'm not going to show you.
It also occurs to me, that there's another interesting connection between proofs and programs, in the sense that programmers have, had their heads banged for literally decades about imperative bad, declarative good. Tony Hoare famously wrote that paper about Goto considered unnecessary, which of course came as a shock to the Japanese scientist Goto. But Dijkstra, sorry, you noted it, yeah. So, but I was going to say, I mean, there's also a style issue in proof. So if you have a proof that says C lemma 3.1, and you look at lemma 3.1 and it says C lemma 6.9, etc., and goes on like that for a very long time, you consider that a very poor proof, really, from a stylistic point of view. So not all imperatives are as good as
No, that's certainly right.
Yeah.
They can be the source of errors just as much as declarative statements.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Thanks again.